Hehr, Alberta Liberal Party MLA from Calgary, Buffalo. Thank you for joining us via Skype. Hehr is also the Shadow Minister for Education and Energy for the Alberta Liberal Caucus. In the legislature, Hehr serves on the Standing Committee on Resource and Environment. He campaigned for mayor in the 2010 Calgary municipal election, but withdrew prior to the vote. With the provincial election slated for some time later this year, do the emerging, mostly unanticipated current federal election scenarios contain seeds of what could happen in a predominantly conservative province? This and more on our program Alberta Live, brought to you by FuseLogic TV. I'm Sunita Kolzuchi, and in the studio with us is Dr. Bob Ascah, currently the director of the Institute for Public Economics at the University of Alberta. This after spending 25 years in Alberta's public sector, including ATB Financial. He has held positions in federal and intergovernmental affairs, as well as the Alberta Treasury. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Sure.
But first, Hehr, we go to you. What's your interpretation of what's happening at the federal level? I mean, given that we are seeing a surge in NDP, we don't know as yet what exactly is going to emerge. It's premature to say that any one party would emerge as a winner. But it does seem that there is a special interest in the NDP. What do you make of this?
Well, you must remember I'm a provincial politician that particularly pays a lot of attention to mostly issues that are happening in Calgary, Buffalo. That said, I'm as interested in the federal election as the next guy, and I find it very interesting that the New Democrats appear to be surging, and it appears it's largely based on Mr. Layton's personal appeal and personal credibility, and he is a very likable guy, and I believe probably a lot of that is resonating right now in the polls. I don't know how much more to read into it other than that.
Some would interpret that the centre-right does not seem to be in, given what's happening in the federal elections. It seems to be centre-left politics because of the economic issues that are haunting many people out there. Unemployment at over 7.8%, and a lot of other issues as well. Healthcare, for instance, at the back of the minds of people. Do you think this is there to stay? First to you, and then, of course, I'll be asking Dr. Ascah as well.
In my view, employment's an issue in every election, whether your unemployment rate is higher than it normally is or is doing pretty well. The direction of Alberta and Canada's economy should be utmost in our politicians' mind, and I think you're seeing a debate over what our national government is going to do to try and lead Canada through what's been a very difficult time, especially in regions outside of Alberta where you've seen significant unemployment and significant shifts in traditional work power or work organizations. And in my view, the economy is always one of those big issues, along with healthcare, as to what our federal government is going to do. And from the perspective of an Albertan, I think you're seeing that being played out by all political parties and creating a different vision for what the national government will do. And I'm actually glad to see all three parties putting out a bit of a national vision on what they're going to do.
Dr. Ascah, how do you interpret this? Do you see a blurring of the Liberal and the NDP portfolio? And do you see a shift towards centre-left politics in North America?
I think there is a shift in politics in North America, Sunita, from the far right into the centre-left, as you said. Partly it's a reaction to this belief that the market can solve all the problems. And we saw that the market unhindered and weak regulation contributed to the financial crisis. The interesting dimension of the center-left competition, I think, really is to what extent that that competition is going to elect more Conservatives. And that's certainly something that the Prime Minister is hoping for. The Prime Minister has enormous credibility relative to the other leaders. And the competency of managing the economy, I would say he takes some credit for what was done by previous Liberal administrations in terms of Paul Martin, when he was finance minister, did not allow the bank mergers to go ahead. Paul Martin, as finance minister, worked very, very hard to get the deficit under control and producing some surpluses, which the Conservatives have inherited. So the other two issues, which I think are defining issues for the party, relate to the environment and oil sands in particular, and secondly, the healthcare debate. And on the healthcare debate, I think that there's some suspicion that the Tories support publicly funded healthcare, but not public healthcare. So there's slight nuances there. All the political parties have to proclaim healthcare as important for them. They've all agreed that they're going to keep raising the amount of healthcare transfers to the provinces. But the Conservatives tend to be more focused on giving the provinces a little bit more authority to make the decisions and to perhaps be a little bit more creative in terms of how they manage the funding of the healthcare system.
We would be discussing all this in detail as the program goes on. But first, how do you see this kind of scenario emerging with if the NDP and the Conservatives join hand, which is a rare possibility, but nothing can be ruled out? What is the kind of fiscal impact? What is the kind of impact it would have on the fiscal outlook for the country?
Well, I think in the minority situation of a Conservative New Democratic government, you would have demands placed by the New Democrats on such things as programs for seniors, a pharmacare program, a child, not home care, but daycare programs. The Conservatives will want to have lower taxes. So I think the probabilities of seeing that kind of merger are unlikely. What is really interesting, of course, is if the Conservatives do not get a majority government and they bring in the budget that they brought in March, will that be defeated, or will they make some compromises that the other parties would like to see? One other kind of historical note, Sunita, is that in fact Conservative governments are not always the most fiscally prudent. We saw in the Mulroney administration the deficit he inherited from Trudeau continued to go up. And it really wasn't until 94 under Chrétien that the government got spending under control. You can see that in terms of provincial politics as well. In Saskatchewan, Grant Devine, who was a Conservative, kind of put the Saskatchewan finances in peril. And the NDP, that is very, in Saskatchewan, they're kind of like a Liberal Party. There's not that much to distinguish them. The NDP has had a very good fiscal record. And you can see that in the United States as well, that the Democrat administrations have been more fiscally responsible than the Republican administration. So there's a little bit of a paradox there.
So do you think that the NDP would have a chance? Sorry, Hehr. Yeah, Hehr.
Oh, I would like to add on to what Dr. Ascah has been saying here. If you look at the record of our federal policies on fiscal responsibility, I guess if we look back, the Trudeau government, they added to budget deficits, but so did the Conservatives under Mulroney. The budget deficit exploded under Mulroney, and it wasn't until the Chrétien Martin years that there was a real attention to paying down the public debt and managing our finances more closely with what we bring in. And the interesting thing is under Mr. Harper, we would have what we would call a Keynesian government principles coming into play, which are essentially liberal government philosophies of borrowing more money, spending more money in times of a downturn. And that has been very evident. We see that with a large public debt that has been run up under a conservative administration for the last 5 years.
I must jump in here because the Conservatives are not here. But that if the Conservatives would not be spending or would not be investing in infrastructure and other kind of spending during a downturn, there would be allegations that they are letting the economy go to the dumps. So it's a catch-22 situation. It's not that we have to give them the due for having done what other parties as well are clamoring for, which is jobs, which is, in fact, the Liberals and the NDP, if you look at their portfolios, they've been talking very, very clearly about the kind of extra spending that they would be doing. For instance, the spending on social issues. And when we look at where they would be getting the revenues from, it's issues like, policies like cap and trade, which some may argue is a fantastic policy, but in terms of garnering the kind of revenues in the first 3 or 4 years till it's actually stabilized and it has at least a North American footprint, may be a difficult task. Would you agree to that, or would you say that they have other avenues of revenue which are responsible and, which...
Well, one of the comments on the environment, Sunita, is that the Liberals would eliminate the accelerated capital cost allowance for the oil sands, and that is a fairly small amount of money. And they would put that back, I believe, into greener technologies. The cap and trade system, of course, is one where the American administration supports that, and that's likely where the Harper administration will come. But it's not something that the Premier of Alberta is particularly supportive of. I think my own personal view is a carbon tax would be more straightforward, and it would be something that would discourage the consumption of petroleum, and that money would be put back into energy efficient and renewable resources. The Conservatives are very interesting in terms of their platform on funding non-renewable, and what they're saying is that they have to be economically viable. So some of the platforms are a little coy in terms of the promises, because when they come into power, they are always looking at the reality of the deficit and how they can hedge their promises to perhaps say, well, circumstances have changed.
Well, why is it always taxation? Why is it always taxation? I mean, why do governments always rely on this great mantra of raising revenues through taxation? I mean, look at the Liberal platform or look at the NDP platform, because eventually at the end of the day, it's people like us who pay the taxes. So, I mean, this is an ongoing debate. Yes, Hehr, you were saying that you were... Well,
I'd like to... I'd like, before I comment about your next question, but I think you're looking at on our energy policies and especially our environmental policies that are coming out of both the New Democrats and the Liberals are not substantially different from those policies that were the Conservative administration before, especially under Minister Prentice. They were talking about that very much before, right after President Obama came into power. Essentially, the day after President Obama came in, many people in Calgary, at the direction of Minister Prentice, said, hey, we're going to look at a cap and trade system. The Americans are going to go to this, and we're going to dovetail our policy along with theirs. And to a certain extent, although I can't speak for Mr. Layton or for Mr. Ignatieff, what they're doing by this is just making it more public, the reality that our economy is tied pretty closely to the United States. They're thinking about moving to this model, and they're being open that we have to consider this as one of our ways of controlling emissions, of allowing things to go forward, while at the same time we have to recognize, and I think Alberta politicians recognize, that we have to do things slowly that do not necessarily impact our industries. That's gonna shut things down, gonna stop things, as we're doing a not only an important role here in Canada for bringing in jobs, but also for the rest of the world. let's
So
look
what's
here.
the thinking at the provincial level? I know that the province is not talking about cap and trade. So what is the thinking right now as far as the taxation or cap and trade goes?
Well, I really, I think we just got to be concerned at our emissions level in general. We have to continue to push the envelope because I think it's very important for politicians in Alberta to understand that having the cleanest energy possible is in Alberta's long-term interest. Is having our tight control on producing energy is in our long-term interest, and we ignore the best technology that's available or the best practices that are out there. We do it to our own peril, okay? And I think we are at the precipice of understanding that here in Alberta, that we have to continue along this path, or else the world will move beyond us and look for other ways of doing things, which will be to, I think, our peril here in Alberta. We have to do things the best we can, and in my view, we could be doing things better than they are here in Alberta. And I think the Canadian government is looking at that and trying to influence us in some ways to behave in a more environmentally friendly manner.
So what is the thinking as far as, I know that the Alberta Liberal Party does not have affiliation with the federal Liberal Party, but it's not been a very strong force as far as the provincial voice is concerned in terms of checks and balances of a strong Conservative government so far. There's been lack of policy direction from the Liberals as much as you may say there's been from the Conservatives. How would you respond to that, even in terms of energy policies? There's no thinking whether it should be a carbon tax or a cap and trade. What's your reaction to that?
Well, in my view, the provincial Liberals have we have in our energy policy that we're going to look to cap emissions here in Alberta by 2020. Going to continue to work with our technology fund that here in Alberta that's going to continue to look at the 100 top emitters and maybe look at expanding that out to having more emitters caught in our technology model, and look at bumping up the price of carbon here internally. I think the Alberta Liberals have shown some very strong leadership on environmentally where we go in the future. In my view, the current setup here in Alberta on our technology fund is actually a good system. However, it needs to be strengthened with better enforcement measures, better regulation of what is going into our air and our water, and having some monitoring done by our Alberta government. It can't just be turned over to industry. If you look at our compared to our federal government, we can say that there has been relatively little action on the environment. Hey, we signed the Kyoto Accord in 1990, and let's face it, Chrétien Martin governments did very little on that front.
Leaving the environment
here.
So what do you see is going to be the impact of the current political scenario on the provinces, especially Alberta? Do you see that this move towards the far right that was gaining momentum in Alberta will take a back seat because of what's happening at the federal level? Or do you think that's not going to happen?
In my view, Alberta's got to play a role in this, and I'm hoping a leadership role. If Alberta doesn't participate in an open and honest way about the emissions that are coming out of our province, then it'll be to our peril. But I still think with a government in the province and open to ideas and a dialogue with our federal counterparts, whoever is in power. Whoever is in power has to recognize this, that Canada needs Alberta, Alberta needs Canada, and we're dovetailed together on these issues. And I don't see them as being mutually exclusive.
How would you look at the federal impact on the provinces, the impact of the federal elections on the provinces? Do you see a different political scenario emerging as far as Alberta goes?
Well, if the Conservatives are denied a majority government, there may be some resentment among Alberta, which is solidly Tory, and create some kind of Western alienation, which we've seen in the early 80s around the National Energy Program. So that's one particular scenario. The other concern that I have is, or comment that I would have, is that the Premier has made some comments about the transfers under the Canada social transfers, and the concern that Alberta isn't getting the same per capita. Now, there's some nuances around how they calculate tax points and so on, but that is an issue where I think a Conservative majority would be more open to that sort of thing. On the environment, we've seen, even under the Conservative minority government, pushing on the water monitoring. And I think all three parties now have a better understanding and agree with the importance of having a scientific, rigorous monitoring of the water. The other comment, I'm just feeding off of some of the things that Kent has been saying, is the question of a strategic alternative for the oil sands to China and Asia. And that is important because there is still some constituency within the U.S. Congress that doesn't want our dirty oil. So if you were able to build a pipeline through the British Columbia interior to Kitimat and then ship outside North America, your problem with the Americans being our only market goes away. But as I understand the Liberal program, they're not supportive of ocean tankers. The other comment on the NDP platform, Sunita, that's interesting is that they are very sympathetic to adding value to the oil sands in the form of refining. And that is perhaps, it's in the same vein as what Premier Stelmach's been trying to accomplish, but it seems to go a little contrary to capping emissions or limiting emissions.
And the huge investments that are required in refineries, especially if we see across the border down south, they've had issues with refineries. They're old refineries. They've not been able to add capacity. And, there's been this whole issue around the refineries. That's a lot of investment. Do you think that's difficult to come by, given the scenario, the investment scenario, given the downturn, given all that? How feasible is this now?
With respect to finding the investment capital for refineries, I think the industry in the United States is private industry, and they have access to capital markets through issuing more stock or issuing debt. So I don't see that as a particular barrier. I think the real barrier is the regulatory environmental barrier and the process that you have to go through in order to set up and build.
So correct me if I interpret.
Jump in here?
Yeah, just one moment, Ken. So if I've interpreted you, what you're trying to say is that in order for us to go about refining our oil and have all these refineries, we need a solid environmental framework so that industry knows this is what we are up against, that the changing of government does not mean changing of policy issues, at least as far as environment goes, or have I not?
Well, no, the industry likes a stable environment. The industry would like itself to be treated the same way as its competitors. And I think there's some view in the industry is that if the federal government and the province didn't tiptoe around the issue, but put in very, very strong environmental rules, the industry would know that's the rules that we're playing, it's predictable, and they'll go forward on that basis.
Because banks are finding it difficult also to finance high risks because of the environmental hullabaloo or the environmental noises that are being made around Alberta oil. So we see a distinct problem in terms of capital, raising capital, because the risk for the banks goes up, and so the interest rates for lending go up, at least as far as the oil industry goes. That is the thinking as well.
Well, you always have a concern that if a company is put into receivership and it has environmental liabilities, how is that going to play out from the bank's point of view? And I'm not a real expert on that.
Kent, you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, on Alberta, I guess oil policy, and it shows sort of how our provincial politics differ from our federal politics, and I think Albertans get caught up in labels oftentimes. You'll know the Alberta Liberals support the Keystone Pipeline. We believe it's going to add a great dimension to our industry. Have two sources. It's going to Estimates are that it'll add $8 more to every barrel of oil we sell. It just makes common sense that we do that, as long as we're doing it as environmentally sustainably as we can. And that's always the rub. But I think that project, regardless of who gets in power, will go through, and that eventually we're going to work out some of the dynamics thereof. Second thing, you brought up a very good thing about value added. In my view, that's again a difference in philosophy between center and center-left policy and right-wing policy. We believe, as Alberta Liberals, there's a role to play for the government to regulate our economy a little more, to have more bitumen upgraded here in Alberta. We look at that as province building. We look at it as a real opportunity lost when any bitumen goes south unrefined, and we believe, in our view, that we would do things differently, and we were in government to have more of that petrochemical industry developed here in Alberta. And if you look at the policies of the federal Liberals, the federal New Democrat, they share that view. And I think
it's antithetical to what the industry actually wants. The industry has a lot of investment as far as all these refineries go. It's huge investments. And if you're talking in terms of increasing corporate taxation, which is what the platform for both the Liberals and the NDP is, then the industry might argue that there's no incentive for us to go and build these huge, these are huge capital cost industries. And the gestation period is huge. There are lots of things that go into it. So this is antithetical. I don't see any synthesis here between what the Liberals and the NDP are saying and what they want in terms of the oil industry to do, which is to value add to the product. I mean, to the basic raw product.
I'll push back a little bit on that. What you're seeing is some of the parties doing is calling an end to some of the incentives that have been used to get the oil sands up and running. Okay, I find that consistent. That's not inconsistent with saying we possibly need some incentives to start up a refinery industry. Okay, I think those are two different and separate and distinct issues. Right now, certain political parties look at the oil sands to be and the development up there as being well on their way to be financially sustainable. Those industries are making money and look like they're going to continue making money for quite some time. What we don't have in Alberta right now is people dying to build upgraders, dying to get into the petrochemical upgrading business.
That's
and
because they might find it cheaper.
Just wait. In my view, governments, when they want that type of province building to happen, when they want nationhood or national principles to develop, they are wise to incent the market to do that. And that's what I think government policy should be switched to.
Dr. Ascah, do you think any oil industry would look at comparative costs between having a refinery, let's say in China, where we eventually want to send our oil, vis-a-vis having it in Alberta? How would you argue for this?
I would actually ask Dr. Ascah to answer that question, because I really couldn't hear you there, and I apologize for that. I'll try to catch in here when you repeat it. Either repeat the question or try and follow along with Dr. Ascah's view, or bounce it off what he has to say with my views.
All oil companies have corporate strategy departments, and they run many scenarios over investments, whether it be in China, in Texas, or in Alberta. And they're concerned with a number of things, including environmental liability, taxation, royalties, and the cost to build the facilities. And one of the unfortunate aspects of what I would call Ralph Klein let the market work is that once they had the genetic royalty for the oil sands, generic royalty rather, it created a boom. And the boom sucked resources from other sectors. It hurts Alberta manufacturers because they have to compete. It hurts Alberta governments because they have to compete. And these huge plants were being built in an area which only had 80,000 people in Fort McMurray. Now, to be sure, they're fabricated in other places. But on top of that, then the government stepped in with their capital investment program. So they were driving up costs, and we saw the huge inflation. So that is one of the question marks in the coming boom is how does the government manage that growth? And the Liberal platform does talk about staging these developments. And I think that really is the way to go, because companies will be reluctant to invest if they see the cost of labor and materials skyrocketing.
And I would agree there. You see national companies right now looking for that type of stage growth. Companies like Shell and actually even Syncrude and Total, they're not against government being involved in a strategic plan around our oil sands. In fact, you saw that at the end of the last boom. They weren't particularly that happy the way the Alberta government had managed things here. They thought they let labor prices and the boom mentality get out of hand. So I think Dr. Ascah and actually our leading oil companies are further ahead than our provincial counterparts on that issue.
Moving on, let's talk about fiscal federalism. You've been within the government, and my question, I guess, to you would be: how is it viewed as far as Canada goes? How do you view fiscal federalism, considering that there is an equalization fund, there are other issues involved around?
Well, the election and the debates of the leaders focused quite a bit on the healthcare issue and the transfers to the province. And there's a great deal of angst and uncertainty amongst provincial capitals, within provincial capitals, on after 2014, what is going to happen to the transfer. And the parties have been quite generous in promising that they'll keep the transfers up on a steady state rate. The danger from that is that you're giving the provincial governments a blank check, and the challenge in federal-provincial relations is that the government of Canada doesn't have jurisdiction in healthcare, and yet they're pouring tens of billions of dollars through transfers to the provinces and demanding some accountability through the principles of the Canada Health Act. But it seems to me that the federal government needs to ensure that those principles are being adhered to, and that's one of the distinctions between the Conservatives and the Liberals and the New Democrats, that the Liberals and the New Democrats want to play a more active role in the healthcare debate and the transfers debate. The other thing I would comment on is post-secondary education, and the Liberals under Chrétien found some money to support the Canada chairs in a number of science and humanities fields. And that's been very well received by the university sector.
But do you think that distribution of funds has been equitable wherever the federal jurisdiction is? For instance, there are certain transfers that do take place. Do you think that's been fair, or has it been decided by voter and political allegiances?
Well, there's a number of programs that you could say are not fair. For example, the Employment Insurance Commission, if you're living in areas of high unemployment, the number of weeks you work, you qualify earlier and the benefits are generous. I think that is very, very poor public policy because it discourages migration. With respect to the transfers on the health care, and the Premier has made a number of comments on it, that we're not getting an equal per capita share. It's a complex issue with tax points, but I think that again is a principle where on those per capita grants they should be the same flowing to the provinces.
So does it change every time that the government changes? So, for instance, if we see a different if we see a different political party at the federal level, does it change depending on province allegiances and?
Well, I think that on the political front, that there would be certainly, depending on the number of representatives in provincial governments and the number of cabinet ministers, there would be some bias towards those particular jurisdictions. But Sunita, these negotiations are led at a bureaucratic level, and they are very, very closely watched, and all the provinces and the federal government have elaborate models on under what scenarios do they pay out and who benefits and who gains.
So you don't see it as a major issue in the future, this tussle, this tug of war between provinces and municipalities. In fact, I'll just play a clip by Kent on the fact that municipalities are not receiving as much from the provinces. And
Calgary, right now, the primary...
Yes, Kent, you're saying something? So the whole question of whether this is going to be a tug of war between federal, provincial, and the municipal governments in terms of getting more funding.
Well, I think the municipalities are frustrated that they're not really recognized as an order of government, or they're, and they are subordinate to the provincial governments. The NDP, interestingly enough, on their campaign platform, argued that, they promote a 1 cent a litre tax to go to the municipalities. So I think it would go from 5 cents to 6 cents, and that would, I think, be directed at public transportation. This is always a tug of war, Sunita. It's real dollars that are being lobbied for, and so that is something that a lot of resources are put to at the federal and provincial governments.
Let's hear the clip by Kent first, and then Kent will come back to you. It's about how you are demanding more municipal funds for municipalities. Let's hear that clip.
Calgary, right now, the primary way we get funding is from our provincial government partners. Right now, our property tax is collected. Of the 100% of that money collected, we only get about 50% of that back from the province. I tell you what, we have to come to terms with that as citizens. We have to get a better deal out of our provincial partners. We have to let them know that we are the people who need infrastructure. We are the people with having new immigrants who are coming to our city. We are where the business center of this province is, and we need to ensure that our citizens are getting not only the services they need, but the infrastructure they need. And that has to come with our provincial partners. So I'm going to work very hard on that. Another thing very important to me that I alluded to earlier, we were talking about this city has a choice to make whether we're just going to be a series of roads that lead to downtown and then lead back out to the hinterland. I think we have to keep growing, but on smart growth principles. That's in having 30, 40 years, more people living and working in their own communities, people who are transit-orientated design, where people are using transportation nodes and living around transportation nodes that take them to work, hopefully in their communities, and if not, to downtown by some affordable, accessible means of transportation. We got to be working on that now. We can't just do that by flicking on a switch 40 years from now. We have to work.
What's your reaction to that?
Well, municipalities have significant obligations in terms of policing. They have obligations in terms of public transportation and roads, and those are very expensive things. One of the criticisms of the Klein government in the early 2000s was that they were not keeping up with the capital deficit, the infrastructure deficit. And what Kent is talking about is what are the consequences of that. My take in looking at Alberta budgets, though, is that the Premier, who was a councillor and has very strong roots in the municipalities and good relationships with aldermen and so on, is the municipal capital infrastructure grants have helped the municipalities. And it's one of the choices that you have as a politician in terms of how much you do and what is the pace of that development. And so they have to make those trade-offs. I do think that when you look at the capital budgeting, they were starved in the 2000s. Then they kind of blew the economy up on capital spending. And that unfortunately led to a period of time where the costs of interchanges were doubling or tripling in price. And we really have to get away from that boom-bust spending on the capital side. And I also think that the municipalities do have to take responsibility. They have the ability to borrow money to build infrastructure. They may not like debt, but those infrastructure projects are a long-term investment, and you can set up sinking funds to pay that back over time.
Kent, to you now. You've been talking about managing Alberta's hard-earned tax dollars wisely.
Oh, let me just add on to where this discussion has been going. You're completely right on getting away from the boom and bust funding of our economy. If you look at what we have done here over the course of the last 40 years, it's essentially that we pay for money when the oil wells are pay for things when the oil wells are pumping. When they stop, we stop paying for things, and that's not a way to credibly run a province or a jurisdiction. What we need to do is look at ways where there's sustainable funding, i.e., have a fair and reasonable system in place that allows for that to happen. That doesn't just look at oil booms or busts as one-time things that happen in an economy. You know, we've shown over the last 40 years that we can blow $180 billion in royalties and still not be substantially further ahead than other jurisdictions. If you look, our healthcare system is currently performing 7th out of 10. If you look at our education system, it's roughly a little better than some others around the country, but not so much. You know, what we've learned here in Alberta is that, yes, we can blow petroleum resources in a one-time spending spree, or we can look at things to the long term and hopefully do things more sustainably and possibly save some of that revenue for the future when oil and gas revenues aren't so abundant.
I'd like to come back to expanding Alberta's growth or even other provinces' growth beyond the boom and bust economy. That requires a lot of investment in other other industries. Looking at the banks, I've been doing a bit of studying on the banks. What the conclusions that I come to is that there's too much focus on creating value for shareholders. The Bank of Montreal, for example, has a medium-term goal of increasing EPS, that's earnings per share, by an average of 10% per year, and CIBC has the objective of raising diluted EPS by 5 to 10% per annum. Do you think that somewhere the banking reform needs to be done at a federal level for manufacturing sector to grow, for instance, and get its loans, or do you think it's already well looked after?
Well, one of the ways that banks can increase their earnings per share is more volume in lending to manufacturers and businesses and mortgages and so forth. So I do think that there is an alignment between building their loan book and earnings per share. I think the challenge that the banks face is with this uncertain recovery, and there are warning signs in the U.S. with their tremendous fiscal deficit and the debt crisis in Europe. The Canadian boom that's taking place is a commodity boom based on the demand from Asia for commodities. So the banks have also been asked to set aside more capital, which means their profitability, their leverage is not as great. And that's one of the problems in terms of trying to reach their goals. So there's a little bit on the one side in terms of growing the loan values. There's the other side where there's limits to how much that they can grow for their shareholders. Governments have, I think, been fairly responsible with the supervision of the banking system. had the banks been allowed to merge, they probably would have entered into some of these asset-backed markets, mortgage-backed securities in the U.S. and could have lost billions of dollars. Bank of Montreal and CIBC were hit a little bit from their investments down in the United States. So in Alberta, of course, we have Alberta Treasury branches and credit unions that provide some alternatives to the major banks.
But still, there is a worrying issue here. Kent, I'll just get back to you. The worrying issue is that the Moody's rating for outlook for the majority of Canadian banks is negative, and BMO and that's Bank of Montreal and RBC were placed under review in the fourth quarter of 2009 by Moody's. Plus, there's this whole thing, the pressure that could come about by Basel, the
yes.
capital adequacy norms increasing, and the Volcker
rule.
rules.
Yes.
So these are issues that may further constrain the banking sector and further have implications for the manufacturing sector. Given these financial realities, if they set into action, what do you think is likely to happen?
Well, the Volcker rule, I think, is a sound rule because what it does is if you are taking money from depositors and enjoy the deposit insurance net from the federal government, you can't use depositors' money to, I wouldn't say gamble, but to trade in certain commodities or certain elaborate financial instruments. So that is saying to really investment banks that like to make money through proprietary trading, you can't do that under the shelter of the deposit insurer. The second issue relates to the too big to fail question, and we've seen the dangers of that, where even investment banks that weren't covered by deposit insurance were bailed out by the Federal Reserve, because they were probably too complex to fail. They had a whole range of off-balance sheet derivatives and things like that that would have made a bankruptcy of Bear Stearns very, very complicated to unravel, and the authorities convinced the politicians they needed to act and use extraordinary powers. But to say that an institution, and this is where some of the reforms are going, is too big to fail, creates what is known as moral hazard, which is that the risk profile of the government looking after taxpayers is different than the risk profile of a trader that is prepared to take risks because they get a significant part of the profits, if there are any.
What is worrying to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is the loan diversification. Despite all that's happened in the U.S. around mortgages and around real estate, the low diversification of banks. For instance, I was studying figures, and 23% is real estate and mortgages, natural resources coming down to around 10.5%. This is the investment portfolio of overall Canadian banking system. And the financial institutes exposure is again high. It's 14%, and for BMO it's as high as 23%. Manufacturing, it's come down to just 7.2%.
Yes.
So the implications for the economy, how are we talking about job creation, about expanding our manufacturing base when these are bare facts that are glaring at us? I mean, how do you increase, for instance, loans to manufacturing sector?
Well, under our system of government and belief in the market, the government does not play a role of really saying we need more banks, you go and lend to manufacturers. I think if you look at the size of manufacturing in the economy over the last 30 years, you'll see that shifting to more of the service-providing industries, the entertainment industry, the consulting industry. There's a wide range in information technology and so on. So without going into it in a lot of detail, I would say that does reflect the change in terms of the composition of the economy.
Yes, Ken. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Hey, in my view, tying this banking issue a little bit to the to what's transpiring in this right now in the national scene, there's two things that all Canadians, in my view, should be thankful to Jean Chrétien for, regardless of whether you're a card-carrying New Democrat, a card-carrying Conservative Party member, or a card-carrying Liberal. The first thing is that we didn't go to Iraq. you remember there was a lot of pressure from some opposition parties saying we should go to Iraq. The second thing is that Mr. Chrétien resisted a move to create more, at that time was called more competition in the banking industry, which is another word for less regulation, that may have then led to some of our banking industry not being as strong or not being able to or wouldn't have stood up to some of the scrutiny that the American banks felt pressure to in this recent downturn. Another thing that that Dr. Ascah brought up was the fact that the unwinding of all those mortgages down there. You remember in 2006, the Harper government brought in 40-year mortgages with no money down. That we have, in the last round of budgets, took a lot of responsibility for, and the taxpayer is now going to be on the hook for some of those here in Canada. So I think some of those decisions leads to us to have some regulation in the banking industry, have government oversight in the banking industry, and that's not a bad thing. And I think we've seen that play out in the world economic system over the last number of years.
But then mortgage, I mean, it depends on the liquidity, and I mean, the rules keep changing. So one cannot be too harsh on the conservatives and say that the down payments were easy, to mortgages were easier, because it also depends on the central bank policy at that point in time in terms of interest rates, etc. But the point to be made is, as the NDP has made, is the profitability on high spreads, in terms of, getting more out of charging interest from the consumers. Do you think that is a feasible thing to be working at?
Well, again, it depends very much, Sunita, on the values you bring to that question. And there's two sides to the issue. On the one hand, banking can be seen not only as an economic function, which is bringing borrowers and lenders together, but it also is a social function in terms of how currency is distributed and making the economy work, the lubrication of the economy. With that kind of premise that there's a broader social public policy reason, you could then make the next step, which is to say that banking is too important to be left to the banks. And in some ways, that was the case made when the Central Bank of Canada was created during the Great Depression. There was not the lending going on that the government wanted to see. On the other hand, you wonder whether governments or bureaucrats are capable of making these allocative decisions. And those decisions are very important for making sure that you're funding the best kind of loans and you're not taking any risks, because at the end of the day, there's a depositor that believes that when they ask for their money, they're going to get it back. And so the government perhaps has gone a little halfway in that they have the Business Development Bank, they have the Export Development Corporation, so those are federal entities. There's the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation that Kent referred to, which insures mortgages. So there is involvement of government in the industry and supporting the economy, but where you draw the line is always a judgment related to, is the state going to make things worse, or is it going to improve things?
Are you worried about some of the off-balance sheet exposure of our banks in other countries and foreign countries? Do you think that needs to be revealed as well?
Well, the Bank of Nova Scotia is one of the major banks that has significant operations in the Caribbean and Latin America. My sense of the Bank of Nova Scotia is they've been doing this for quite a period of time. They understand the market, and they are well capitalized. The Canadian banks have ventured into the United States, BMO, Royal Bank of Canada, and TD Bank, with not overwhelming success. And again, that is a concern. If you're a shareholder, the Canadian banks operate very profitably in Canada, so why should they be wasting shareholders' money in the United States where the returns are low? And that is one of the reasons that the Royal Bank is looking at selling their U.S. operations.
How would you, this whole thing about the high loonie, isn't there a way that it could be turned around to make it an advantage for Canada? For instance, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, it's a shot in the dark, but making it a reserve currency, for instance, would that help?
Well, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency with not the downgrade by Standard & Poor's, but the warning that they
given
put,
its outlook, yeah.
Their outlook. The Chinese, who hold huge amounts of American dollars, and the Japanese and others, because that is the only game in town, that's starting to change, and we've seen the U.S. dollar go down. The advantage to Canadians with a higher dollar is if you travel abroad, that is of benefit. And over time, import prices or prices of import should come down, reflecting the value of the Canadian dollar. Now, if you're the Alberta government, on the other hand, for every cent the dollar goes up, they're losing $154 million because the value of oil in Canadian dollars is going down. So the other challenge for Canadian business is to use lower import prices and the cost of machinery and equipment that has to be imported. They can save money on those machines and make their businesses more profitable and productive.
There's a gnawing need. Sorry, Kent, yes?
Oh, just on the other side of that, hey, the high dollar has implications generally for Ontario's exports. Yeah. When we're exporting our finished goods from Ontario, that is a high dollar, which I think is probably going to be in the cards in the main for the next foreseeable future. I'm saying 10 years anyway. This has a real impact on on the way our economy as a nation has run over the last 100 years, which has primarily been on a low Canadian dollar. And we have to be worried about that as a nation going forward, how we're going to increase our competitiveness and how we're going to deal with this on an ongoing basis.
Moving on to this talk about digital economy strategy, internet connectivity, that means a lot of laissez-faire, which would mean a lot of opening up. And correct me if I'm wrong, do you see that happening? There's a kind of a monopolistic attitude. The same media company is a telecommunication company, and barely 1.5 companies in all these, telecommunication and media. Some doors need to be opened there, or is that being too laissez-faire at a time when there's so much of fear of losing jobs?
Well, if you look at the history of telecommunications, you have large capital investments made in phone lines and supporting that throughout the country and in remote areas. It's very costly to provide those services. So the evolution was regulated phone companies, and there was one in Quebec and Ontario that was private, and then many of the other provinces, they were run by the provincial government because it was seen as an essential service. The Tories in Ottawa have been trying to promote more competition, and you have Win Mobile, which received a license and then it was challenged in the court. So we'll see how that goes. But there does seem to be in the Conservative Party a little bit more support for broader competition. And it's a constantly evolving industry, as you know. So with new technology coming in, and that can disrupt the incumbent players.
And one question that I just can't resist asking you, I'm not too certain how incorrect I might prove to be in that, but I won't hesitate. Is there a structural change taking place in the job market? Is there a shift in terms of a complete permanent loss of manufacturing jobs? Do you see that as happening? And does that void need to be filled up?
Well, I think that is the case because of robotics, because of information technology and those sorts of things. And the new jobs are in IT, which is designing software to operate those robots. And we'll continue to see that transformation and the transition for labor in the developing countries, they're not paid as well as they are in this country and in the OECD. So entrepreneurs and businesses owned by shareholders are trying to produce their goods at the lowest possible price, and they're doing that with what they call offshoring. That will be continued. But then there's other industries which are more locally based, whether they're construction or whether they're the media, which can be set up and run in small studios such as this. And so you have more competition in those areas. But those are the areas of new jobs. When you build a games program, when you build, have a movie, there's hundreds and hundreds of people that are involved in that. And those are pretty high-quality jobs.
Yes, Kent, you want to say?
If I could just make this is my final comment. I have to go write my question for question period now. But I'd like to say that Dr. Ascah's comments are very good on the direction our economy is going to go in. But I think us here in Alberta, for what's going to keep our competitiveness, in fact, provincial governments and federal governments got to realize that to keep our competitiveness and to keep our nation going in the correct direction, we need continued devotion to our education system. One thing that really worries me here in Alberta is the fact that we have the lowest percentage of people graduating from high school right here in this province. That's not impacting us right now, but 30 years from now, that's going to impact us. We have the fewest per capita seats in university right here in Alberta. We need to change that. And if we're going to be able to remain competitive going forward, we'll tell you what, those things are going to have to change. But those are my final comments. I've enjoyed the heck out of being here, Sunita and Dr. Ascah, and I would love to take part sometime in the future and to go forward from there. All the success, guys.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Perfect. Take care, guys.
Anything else you'd like to add to this before we wind up and say?
Well, Kent has raised the question about education, and this comes back to the seemingly boom-bust funding in both education and higher education. And that, in some respects, Sunita, reflects the flow of revenues. So you can see the volatility in the revenues, but the expenditures on social services, on health care, on education, and so on, they go up in a stable manner. And it seems to me that it would be logical to bring in a retail sales tax in Alberta that would assist the government in being able to fund these programs over the long term rather than having money and spending the money. And the other issue, of course, is having a savings plan which you can build and reinvest in the Heritage Fund or some fund, and that would in turn give you a constantly growing stream of income to fund those programs, which the oil patch is used to prices going up and down. They're geared to that. People that go into the oil patch understand that they may not be working 3 months from now. But if you're a nurse, if you're a hospital administrator, that instability of funding, which is based on the annual provincial budget, that is not necessarily a good thing for the delivery of public services.
Dr. Ascah, it was a privilege having you here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
On that note, thank you for joining in. We'll see you again.